Hello again, everybody. Welcome to another episode of We Should Talk. Mr. Senator, how you doing over there?
I'm doing splendid, Solaris. How are you?
I am doing just fine. I'm actually working on buying a new car. You got any new car buying advice?
Oh, well, don't sleep on Craigslist. That's what I try to tell people when they get ready to think about buying a vehicle. I know Craigslist has a reputation that isn't necessarily pristine, but there are opportunities out there to find really good cars for really good prices. You just have to be smart about it. Be a smart consumer, but definitely don't sleep on Craigslist.
All right. Well, I'm just as long as you don't get murdered, I suppose it's probably an okay deal, huh? Anyway,
Well, you don't want to meet anybody up at like 3 in the morning trying to make a $3,000 car purchase. But yeah, and that yeah,
bring
okay.
cash only.
Yeah.
Okay. So today, Mr. Senator, we are going to talk about our wonderful two-party system. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's a lot
ugly.
of ugly. Yes. And so the basic idea is we just want to talk about the two-party system. We'll talk about the potential benefits. There are some actual benefits. I think a lot of people don't think about the benefits very often. We're going to talk about the downsides, which are obvious for most people, but maybe some that we don't think about. And then maybe alternatives, and where as a country we might go from here. What might be our options in the future? So I'm going to pass it to you, Mr. Senator. Let's talk about the two-party system, the good, bad, and the ugly. What do you think?
Well, first I want how unique it is in this country. This country compared to other countries in the world, especially the major countries, that we have a two-party system. We see in a lot of countries across the globe a parliamentary-style multi-party systems where you have party factions, what they call. So you have these small groups of constituents and elite members who represent religions, ethnicities, ideologies, or SES, socioeconomic status, and they form these small factions and they go to whatever the capital is and to the legislature, and they form coalitions at the legislature, but not at the electoral level. Whereas here in the United States, we have at the electoral level, we have big tent umbrella coalition parties that people elect. They go to Congress and they're in these huge tents and they encompass all of these what in other countries would be separate parties. So the Democratic Party in, say, a country in Africa somewhere, sub-Saharan Africa, would probably look like, you'd have the Black Coalition, and you'd have the Latino Coalition, you'd have the Gay and Lesbian Coalition, you'd have the labor unions, it would be about 10 different groups making up this one party. And in the United States, we have big tent parties. And I think to note, because in this country, we have an expectation about our parties that they will encompass these coalitions of small groups, and they will serve these coalitions in a way to placate them in many ways. And the expectation is that these parties will be there to facilitate discussion and legislation and policy between these groups, these self-interested groups, and then we get like one big happy platform, and then we go from there in terms of the rhetoric and whatnot. But so that I want to make that distinction. And then there's this idea in this country that the two-party system is here to stay. That to talk about challenging the two-party system is folly. That it just in the history, there's never been a case or a long period of time where there have been more than two parties fighting out, and that it's an unreasonable expectation to think that going forward in the future that we would ever see anything different. I was reading a book earlier today that was written by Edward J. Flynn, and most people will not know who Edward J.
I have
Flynn is.
no idea who he is.
But he is the former machine boss of the Bronx, the borough in New York. And he started off in the Tammany machine in New York, the infamous Tammany machine. And he wrote this book, and it's kind of awesome because this is a first person account of someone who was considered a powerful boss, and some is sort of a lost. It's certainly not something that exists as flagrantly as it did in the early 20th and going back into the 19th century.
Right.
But this guy, one of the things that he said in the book when he was talking about the party systems, or the two parties in the country, is that he said it was ridiculous for people to complain about two parties and to clamor for something else because these parties are here to stay. And he said something to the effect of, in order to change the game, you have to play the game. So you have to be a part of these existing parties to change the system, and you have to do it from within. And that, I think, is really uniquely American. I don't know if that's something that exists across the world. And so I don't know what your reaction to that is, but that's sort of the first bit I wanted to talk about before I get into a little bit of the hurdles in this country outside of sort of the expectation that two parties are here to stay, but the hurdles that go on with the creation of a third party, or at least a viable one. You have any reaction to any of that?
Well, yeah, and I maybe you're going to get to this later on, but I think what you're saying, you're talking about the big tents versus all these kind of micro state type democracies, where you got the little party that does this little thing and little party that does this little thing. Part of me wants to say, well, gosh, shouldn't we have a House of Representatives, for example, that actually has people who are there to represent the most left wing and the most right wing and the most moderate versions all between, kind of like the full gradient of ultraviolet light, if you think about the spectrum of light, right? The whole thing, let's get it in there, right? Let's make sure everybody's represented. I wonder whether people wouldn't feel like they were better represented.
Right.
And I also wonder, when you talk about the big tent thing and kind of working from within the party, it makes me think that parties have a kind of moderating influence over kind of the more extreme poles of our electorate. So, instead of, right now we have a big debate, in the Republican Party, was the last election lost for the Republicans because they ran a candidate who was too moderate, or did they lose the election because the moderate candidate had to appeal too much to the conservative, kind of the right part of the conservative base, and so there's this kind of electability versus purity, if that makes any sense. But it's one party, right? And they have to figure this stuff out at the national level, at least, and at the state level a little bit too. And it's a brand, right? And the brand, people buy into this brand. They, becomes if you're the Democrats, you always blame everything bad on the Republicans, and if you're the Republicans, you blame everything bad on the Democrats, right? So the brand makes a difference, and when you have people within that brand, like, I don't know, Todd Aiken. You have people within that brand who are kind of really dragging that brand down, then your star doesn't rise like you'd want it to. Your poll numbers sink, and you're affected. I mean, there's a number of elections that, every single year there are candidates elected simply because they've got an R by their name or they got a D by their name. And they have lots of polling that talks about, the generic Democrat versus the generic Republican. And it really kind of asks the basic question of, what are the tailwinds going into the next election? Now, individual candidates may make a difference, right? Like Chris Christie, right? He might be, he's a Republican, right? But he is winning by humongous numbers in New Jersey. And you got to give him credit because he's dealing with a party that is currently experiencing one of the lowest ratings. Actually, it's the lowest rating in the history of the Republican Party. And so my thought is that I would think normally that this two-party system, the people on the farthest on the right have to work with the moderates in the middle, and they have to come up with a party platform and a party brand that appeals to enough people so they can win presidential elections. Same thing goes for the Democrats. They have a lot of people on the far left, and they have all these moderates, and they have to have a brand that works for presidential elections across the country, and Senate races and House races across the country. That doesn't too negatively affect those particular candidates and boosts the candidates on occasion when the tailwinds or the headwinds are particularly strong in favor. Like, for example, in 2008, the tailwinds were horribly against the Republican Party because of the presidency of George Bush and a number of other things. But so that is my first thought, is that it may serve as a moderating influence. Obviously, I don't know if I quite agree with that myself, because... Well, go ahead.
I think that's a very good point. And another thing I'd written down is that even when we have, or even though we have sort of these big tent parties, the platforms are not often, or I should say, the parties don't often run on generic platforms, in that the parties often shift focus based on the saliency, the political saliency of the day. And what I mean by that is you have sort of these intra-party groups that they gain and they lose prominence based on this political saliency. So, for example, the much ballyhooed three-legged stool of the Republican Party.
Right.
You have the fiscal conservatives, the social conservatives, and the war hawks. And if you go back in the last, since the beginning, the first term of Ronald Reagan, you can see the Republican Party has shifted on one leg or two of those legs of that stool over the course of the last 30 years or 40 years. They shifted from being sort of the social conservative, fiscal conservative Reaganites to more social conservative, war hawk, neoconservative under Bush. And now we've got a really strong fiscal conservatism, while social conservatism is sort of on the back burner. And I have no doubt that in the next, in 15 or 20 years, when fiscal conservatism has become less of an important issue to the electorate and to the party, that will fall to the wayside, and something else will creep up. Maybe the war hawks will reemerge.
Yeah.
And because that shift happens, there is sort of a you get your moment in the sun, if you will, as a faction, whether you are a left faction, a left faction in the Democratic Party, or you're a rightward faction in the Democratic Party. It's sort of like, 15 years ago, Blue Dog Democrats were a very powerful caucus within the Democratic Party. And it's shifted now to more the progressive caucus. They're now more powerful, and the Blue Dogs are fell by the wayside. So Blue Dogs had their influence on policy in the party once upon a time ago, and it shifted because the saliency of the political atmosphere right now is more of a left flank progressive influence.
Right.
And so, while these big tents exist in sort of drowning out, I think, the fringes of these big coalitions, there are moments in each individual caucus within this big tent has a moment in the sun.
Right.
And maybe that's why they've been able to sustain themselves over the last 200 plus years, that they do that.
That's a great point, because what that says is political parties serve as a moderating influence, but sometimes, kind of in general, but sometimes these certain really important, salient groups, or these groups that they have these salient issues that are part of that tent, do get to come out and play, do get to really voice their opinion and really get policies that support their side, typically in response to national events, things like that, I would imagine. But it's a great point, because, sometimes it's not moderating. And that, you've got, I think right now, you said that the progressives are having their day in the sun. For Republicans, you've got right now you've got Ted Cruz and you've got Rand Paul and you've got more of a libertarian group of people out there, and they're being heard much more than your. Right now it seems like the Republican Party is really split between people who, like moderates, who really don't seem to have a particular ideology other than being in opposition to the president, to Republicans that seem to have an actual ideology. And so, the party leadership would love to kind of tamp down on some of this ideologically pure commentary from people the likes of Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, but at the same time, it's pleasing many, many, many people and keeping many, many people in the Republican Party that might otherwise leave to form another party. And that actually may get to something you would want to bring up is, is the Tea Party going to be the next independent party if they can't seem to figure out a way to have a presidential candidate, most likely a presidential candidate who can unify the Tea Party element and the moderate elements? I'm not sure that's possible, but I'm curious to see what you think about that as well.
Well, let's talk about that's a really nice segue into the next part of this. Before we get to the sort of the benefits and the downsides of the two-party system, I wanted to bring up the hurdles of forming a third party. At least, like I said before, at least forming a viable third party. And the two-party system, both parties, they may not do much together in terms of policy and passing, legislation in Washington, but they definitely are on the same page when it comes to silencing and stomping out any kind of a growing base of alternative party in the states, in the districts. They have passed laws that are so rigid. I wrote down 4 points. These are 4 hurdles for a third party. Money is a hurdle.
Yeah.
The two parties, they suffocate the market in terms of where money is coming from, in terms of Wall Street and special interest money and things of that nature. And it's not even so much the two parties being active in making sure that third parties are not raising money. It's that self-interested special interest groups in Wall Street, executives and people with a lot of money are not going to want to give money to a candidate or a slate of candidates or a party that they know has no chance of winning.
Right.
And so therefore it's a waste of money.
Yeah, typically money follows what the market thinks is who the market thinks is going to win. That's why a lot of people wait to invest a lot of money until way later in the races. Honestly, sometimes when it's too late for a candidate, they would prefer to have more money earlier. Right.
The second point certainly has to do with the two parties collaborating.
I'm sorry, say that again, Mr. Senator?
I said certainly the two parties have a hand in collaborating and making sure that access to the ballot is very difficult for potential third-party candidates, and that they have to get so many signatures and they have to come up with money, and they have to jump through a lot of hurdles to get ballot access. And of course, we know that there's no way a third party can emerge in a way that it's going to be successful unless they have access to a ballot. I mean, there have been write-in candidates, but it's very rare for a write-in to win an election. So the parties got together really, really early in this process and said, this is not going to happen. We got to make sure that we make it really hard for these folks to come out of the fringes and to challenge our candidates in these elections.
Are you going to talk about the, as an example, are you going to talk at all about the America Elects issue? What happened with that?
Are we referring to the online campaign?
Yeah, the big campaign to kind of get a person on all the ballots in all 50 states ultimately failed. They couldn't find a candidate that they could agree on, and then use to fill in that spot that they held.
Well, and here's the problem with that, and you just said it. You can't have two big tent umbrella parties and then try to create a third. There just isn't enough room in the sort of the political spectrum of things to create a third big tent party. You only are going to have more parties if the parties are smaller, they're more splintered, they're more specific, they're more particular. And you can't have a third party, a generic third party, where all the sort of disenfranchised, disenchanted, dispirited voters that exist in the United States decide they want to support a single candidate. Why would that be any different than the Democrats or the Republicans? Because someone who's far out on the right flank, a Tea Party conservative who doesn't support the Republican candidate, is not going to support the same third party president candidate that a Green Party member who doesn't want to support the Democratic candidate is going to vote for.
Yeah.
I think that might be why it failed, because they're trying to create a third big tent.
Well, I also think that part of the reason is because a lot of people don't want to become the candidate, the third party candidate that really screwed the person that they're most like. So if you're, I don't know, Ross Perot, you don't have a problem with this. You're going to go ahead and get, what do you get, like 22% or 21%? 19% of the vote, yep. And ended up having one of the first times, I guess, it was actually since Carter, I guess, since a president did not win re-election. And that was a huge blow to the Republican Party. I don't think it's kind of hard to remember back then what that was like. But then we had Bill Clinton, right? And we had 8 years of Bill Clinton, and
right.
Coming off of.
Go ahead. Finish your point.
Well, no, that's really the end of my point. It's like you've got these people who don't want to become the Ross Perots or the Naders of the world, also because many of them have a potential future within the party. I mean, it is a big tent, right? So if they're thinking to themselves, like maybe a Bloomberg, well, maybe I can run as an independent, or maybe I could run as a Democrat. Right. That might work for me. I'm not going to put my name on this ballot, or I'm not going to be the spoiler that got the 1% that made the difference in state X and state Y, and ultimately deciding in favor of a candidate that I am in so opposition to. I think there's a natural reluctance of the electorate to support third-party candidates for that reason, and a natural reluctance on the part of the candidates themselves to be third-party candidates for that reason. I think you really have to be a principled kind of hardcore, non-negotiable type person to run as a third-party candidate.
And let's think practically about this. I completely agree with you what you just said. But in thinking about Ross Perot, sort of as an aside, if you go back and look at the numbers, and look at how close Ross Perot was to winning in a lot of states, he won 19% of the popular vote. But he was very close to winning majorities in a lot of states. He got very sizable, and just imagine an alternate universe that Ross Perot won the presidency. Now, and this is going to my third point, that the two parties control the legislative institutions. So can you imagine Ross Perot as an independent president dealing with Republicans and Democrats in the institution of Congress?
I almost feel like it would be great. And let me explain that.
I think it would be a mess.
Oh, mess. Well, it can't be worse than what we've got now. I mean, my thought is you've got this is the classic strategy of every president. The president who is in the White House, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, cannot perfectly fit within their party. They have to be outside of their party. If you're a Democrat, you have to be a little bit right of your party, the core of the party. If you're a Republican, to be a little bit left. I think, there's a couple reasons for that. Look at Bill Clinton and what he did. He called it triangulation. Right. Mm-hmm. And he is essentially trying to act like an independent person. And part of the reason is because he doesn't want a bunch of negative Democrat ratings, the negative tailwinds on the Democrats, to drag down his presidency. He doesn't want to be so affiliated with Democrats that people immediately think, well, we got to elect a bunch of Republicans, right? He doesn't want that. He wants to be seen as kind of an independent, neutral outsider. Not to mention the fact that the president typically is somebody who wants to be seen as above the fray. And if you're kind of down and dirty in partisan politics and you're always supporting the party line, then, I think people...
the office.
Yeah, it's like it diminishes. It's just one of those things where I think the president wants to appear to be outside of all of that, above all of that. They are the commander-in-chief. Politics only goes so far to them. There are many, many, many duties that they owe this country that are not going to be limited by whatever the political benefits would be to one particular party, to their particular party.
But in the down and dirty of the legislative process and in governing, you have an independent president to members of Congress and members of Congress who owe nothing to this president.
That's true.
There is no incentive to work together because you have party loyalists who will be within the party and in the grassroots who not necessarily who didn't support the person who's in the White House. And that's on both sides. So the president has no way of exerting any sort of influence over self-interested legislators because the self-interested legislators are answering back to the grassroots who are not concerned with boosting up a president who they didn't support in the first place or they didn't get elected in the first place.
But I wonder, that's a good point. But I wonder whether or not there is this. I talked about the reluctancy of people to support a third-party candidate, but I also think that when we've got a system, and maybe this is going past where you wanted to talk about for this point in the program, but I think about it, and you have right now in a two-party system, it's a binary system, and in any binary system, what's good. What kind of adds to one negates from the other. It's kind of one set fixed pie, and it's going to be split between you and me, Mr. Senator, and if I get more than half the pie, guess what you don't get? More than half the pie, right? You get less than half the pie. And so in a two-party system, you've got a situation where any negative for one party any positive for one party automatically hurts the other party. And this sets up really two things. One, it sets up horrible incentives.
Right.
I don't want to accuse Republicans of doing this. I'm not accusing them. I'm simply saying that when you have a party that is out of power and they're up against the president and the economy is bad, and they must pass legislation in order to improve the economy, but everybody in the system knows that the president is most likely to benefit from a good economy, the incentive for the minority party is to do everything possible to
make sure
ensure
the economy fails. Yeah.
Exactly. And so you've got this binary system that really creates this kind of what's good for us is always bad for the other. What's always good for the other is always bad for us. That hurts our country. But I think this ties into the independent president thing, because I wonder whether or not an independent president basically sitting there and saying, guys, let's work together. Guys, let's work together. Hey, why don't we work together? And, hey, let's work together. Whether or not a bunch of Republicans and Democrats squabbling and yelling, and we're not working with you, and you're not from our party, whether the American electorate might say, this is BS, and it would break. The presence of this third party would break this vicious cycle of the two parties, one hitting the other one to oblivion, for example, attack ads. Attacking the other one into oblivion, and they still benefit because the other party's negatives are now higher, right? It's like if there was a third party out there, then attack ads might not just hurt the other side, they may also hurt you equally. In a way that doesn't really exist right now under the current binary system. Because if I am on on the attack, and I hurt the other side's polling by 10 points, I might lose a couple of points, maybe 2 or maybe 3 points for negative attack ads. But you think that I would do that if there was a third-party candidate who promised to be positive the whole time and would be the likely beneficiary of my negative attacks? You know, that's the thing, is if there's this third presence out there, this independent present or maybe even independent party, then it seems to me like maybe that would help break down this binary system, the problems with this binary system that we have.
Well, you made valid points, and it would be very interesting if we were to experience this in our lifetimes. And I certainly see that it would be more possible or more plausible that we would have an independent president than we will a sizable Congress who will be have an independent label on them.
Right.
And so, going back to the point about the two parties controlling the legislative institutions, which is why I think that you probably won't see it, because when we have seen independent candidates win elective office, and we've seen very few, but when we have, usually these candidates get swallowed up in the majority caucuses. So if you are a independent who is to the left of center, you're probably going to caucus with the Democrats, and if you're a quote-unquote independent to the right of center, you will caucus with Republicans.
Now,
and
Mr.
sometimes
Senator,
the independent.
For those of us who don't know what caucusing means, why don't you make sure that the audience is familiar with what that means?
It means, so right now we have a 55-45 split in the United States Senate, and right now we have two independent senators, and the other is Angus King. Bernie Sanders is from Vermont, and Angus King is from Maine. What is it about the New England states? I don't know. About them and independent candidates, I don't know. But Bernie Sanders and Angus King are counted among Democrats, even though they were elected as independents, and because they quote caucus with the Democrats, meaning they are part of the Democratic majority, and that the majority leader counts them as party members, even though they were elected as independents. And more often than not, you have Bernie Sanders and Angus King will be voting with the Democratic majority on most, certainly the most contentious issues in the United States Senate. But on most issues, you will see that these men are affiliated more with the Democrats than the Republicans.
Okay.
And that's basically the effect of the caucus. Now, there's a whole lot of like parliamentary kind of things that go behind that, but that's the basic notion of a candidate caucusing with one party or the other. So,
oh, Mr. Senator, we have lost your connection. Why don't you repeat what you just said there? So what?
These institutions are controlled by Democrats and Republicans. So in effect, if independent candidates trickle in slowly into the Congress, you're going to see this swallowing up effect. You see leftists swallowed up by the Democrats and the right flank swallowed up by Republicans. And in effect, you won't have an independent presence in Congress. Now, the only way I see this being changed is if we have one of those seismic realignment elections, only the voters support quote independent candidates instead of Democrats and Republicans. And so then you have a large freshman class of quote independent candidates who come into Congress who will be able to exert some influence and maybe change some of the rules within the institution. Now that is highly unlikely.
Yeah, and I think
president than you will, a majority in the Congress, but what do you think? Go ahead.
No, I agree with that. It's much more likely we're going to elect an independent president. And I think the reason why is because it's one person, and the country overall really dislikes the parties. They really dislike Democrats and really dislike Republicans. Overall approval ratings are very low. And I think if it's one person and they have a coherent philosophy, it's not important that they become... I will say this, though. The problem is with the president, you have to have a significant amount of wealth and power and money to be even elected with the existing party structure, which is, very powerful.
Right.
It provides you with a lot of money, provides you with a lot of connections. It provides you with that D and that R next to your name, which for a lot of candidates is the key to victory in many of these jurisdictions, which, by the way, is another reason why you're going to have a lot of people who are not going to be able to get elected at the local level, because nobody knows anybody's names, and parties become heuristics. They're shorthand for, oh, well, my policies are more like the D's, or my policies are more like the R's, so even though I have no idea who this school board person is and who this dog catcher person is and blah, 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 you go down the list.
You're jumping ahead of me, Solaris.
Oh,
You're
I'm
making
sorry.
one of my points.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I'll wrap it up quickly then. These people are going to these people just use it as a kind of a shorthand proxy way of electing it. So that's another reason why you're not going to have the independents. But the difficulty with the independent becoming a president is, what support structure do you have? I mean, Bloomberg is looked at as a potential candidate for president only because of his immense wealth,
Money,
his fortune, and the fact that he was the mayor of New York and could probably pull out a victory. Mayor of New York City, and can probably pull out a victory in New York City if he were to run for president, which is very important. It means he's going to be able to get some money. It means other candidates aren't going to be able to win the primary in New York, which loses a lot of delegates for them, gives him a pretty big leg up. So could he win? Yes, potentially, especially if you've got a situation where, say, post Hillary Clinton, although I don't know if he'll be around that long or relevant that long, post Hillary Clinton, maybe, there's nobody else out there who can take the role in the Democrat or the Republican Party. That's an opportunity.
I don't want to get off into talking about Bloomberg, because that's a whole other we could spend 40 minutes talking about Bloomberg alone, but I disagree with you there. I don't think Bloomberg is going to be the catalyst for a resurgent independent presidential run. Bloomberg is polarizing, and he's not even all that popular in New York City right now.
Especially with soda pop figures.
Certainly. I mean, you had his hand-picked successor, Christine Quinn, ranked third in the Democratic primary. So his clout is not very high right now in the city of New York, and the anti-Bloomberg is getting ready to get elected mayor. So I don't know how popular Bloomberg would be, and I certainly don't think Mike Bloomberg would be a shoo-in to win the city of New York in some future hypothetical race in the New York primary in 2020.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I was only kind of pointing out that it's his immense wealth that makes him a viable independent party candidate. He's lost his favor with a lot of people, I guess.
I agree. I totally agree. The fourth point I want to make, which is a minor point, and then I want to get into the meat of the two-party stuff, the benefits and the downsides, is media blackout. The media, for the most part, is not interested in third-party candidates unless they are high-profile Mike Bloomberg types who, like you said, are very wealthy. And in Bloomberg's case, he owns a major media conglomerate in Bloomberg News. So, of course, he's going to see his fair share of exposure to that fact. But you're not going to see a small Gary Johnson style guy who's running in a third party, running for president, or running for, even worse, running for the Senate or running for the House, get a lot of exposure from the media. They usually ignore these candidates, and so you have a blackout, and therefore people are not exposed or know who these people are.
Well, the media certainly loves covering the Tea Party, and I wonder whether
Third party.
Well, right, and I wonder whether it might not be more viable for a party to start off as a faction of another party, and then get that media coverage, get that reputation, get that brand built, and then split off and say, no, we're running our own candidates now. We're not part of this party anymore. I think some people have suggested the Tea Party might be the first real chance at a third party in this country, simply because they are so salient. They really believe what they believe, and they are unwilling to kind of play ball at that big tent Republican national level. They don't care about the National Republican Party brand. They don't care that a candidate in New York is less likely to get elected as an R. That doesn't make any sense to them if they're a Tea Partier in Kentucky or Kansas or I don't know, wherever you have Tea Partiers. And so it's like that may break it down. So I wonder whether they're not covering Gary Johnson because Gary Johnson's not interesting, I think, but they are covering the Tea Party. And are you a Gary Johnson fan?
I was a Gary Johnson supporter, but I'm small L libertarian, so.
Well, see, you got
in
libertarianism.
The election of 2012.
The libertarian star is rising. You've got Ron Paul kind of turning into Rand Paul now. You've got the Tea Party, Ted Cruz.
Rand Paul. I don't even want to get on that because I'll just say Rand Paul is not a libertarian. He is a Republican.
Okay.
He may not be an orthodox Republican, but he is a Republican. He is certainly not a libertarian. But let's get to the benefits and the downsides of the two-party system. And you alluded to this before, which is my first benefit of the two-party system, and it's that parties serve as fairly simple political ideological cues for voters. In that big tent parties. If you have just a simple idea of a party's positions, where they sit on the spectrum, you can make some safe assumptions about the party or the candidate who's running. And for low information voters, that makes a big difference. Because if you don't know much you're not very savvy in terms of the politics of certain search on the candidate. If you see the D or the R next to the candidate's name, that's a pretty good cue on who you should support. Right. If you consider yourself a good Democrat or a good Republican, or a liberal or a conservative.
And that explains very well, how some of these kind of not watershed elections. I'm not sure if there's a word I'm forgetting here, but these sea change elections. It really explains how so many Democrats got elected in 2008, and so many Republicans got elected in 2012. There's or 2010. I'm sorry. It's that there are these political wins out there, and you can't tell me that all these people really knew just all the party positions or the particular positions of this particular candidate. No, people for whatever reason really, and obviously we can go into maybe another episode talking about the legacy of G.W. Bush. But people really disliked the Republican Party during George W. Bush. Every Democratic ad was tying every single Republican candidate to George Bush and the Republicans. Everything. And so you can't escape it. And so you go down there to dog catcher, and you go down there to secretary of this, and you go down there to whatever, and you've got, the R was a killer. You don't want that R anywhere near your name during those kinds of elections. And so I think that just is evidence that really confirms just how powerful the party system can be for electing, especially low-level candidates, not senators, not presidents.
I agree. The second point, and you spoke about the binary before, and I think, for the most part, the two-party system, it's a lot cleaner and it's a lot less contentious in terms of passing legislation, landmark legislation, and in terms of running the institution of Congress and other institutions. Because I think factionalism, for the most part, it's been hyped recently. The factions, the Tea Party faction within the Republican caucus has been obstructionist, and we've not been able to get done what we need to get done because this faction is here. And I think some of that is a little overhyped, and I think it's really hyped in terms of how much obstruction is played in the failures, 10 years. But certainly, if you broke each party up into itty bitty little pieces, itty bitty self-interested pieces, you certainly would see a messier political environment. And like you said before, the big tent serves as a way, I think you had made a point, it serves as a way to moderate these various factions, to quiet some of the louder voices, to make sure to even the playing field, and to make sure that these factions are falling in line at the end of the day.
Right.
And that if you had a lot better than if you had 10 factions within Congress, you want to talk about a mess.
Yeah, no loyalty to anybody
No
else
loyalty.
but their little faction.
Exactly. And it's like I'm sure parents out there would say that raising 2 kids is a lot easier than raising 6.
Yeah.
And certainly going on a trip, it's a lot easier to go with 3 people than it is to go with 8. And go ahead.
No, I mean, this just relates back to the whole value of the parties for candidates. A lot of candidates owe their election to Congress, to state seats, to governorships, to even to presidencies, to the D or the R next to their name. They owe it to the party. That's the party that got them there. A lot of people would argue that Barack Obama is a recipient, in part, of the benefit, the huge tailwinds that he experienced in 2008. He got away with having a vague, kind of hopey, changey campaign when any other election where a Republican candidate would have been potentially viable, with actually fair, kind of equal poll numbers, he would have had to actually have some policy positions, and actually get out there and talk about the dirty stuff that normal presidents have to talk about, which is one of the reasons you might have thought that the Romney campaign, the Romney-Obama kind of debates were much messier. I think for the president that time around, but it's this: a lot of these candidates owe their election to the party, and that creates loyalty and cohesion, and it creates moderation, so that finally, at the end of the day, when a bill has to pass, when John Boehner says, "Guys, we have to pass the debt ceiling, or our brand is going to be not just down the toilet, but it's going to be sitting in a heaping pile of sewage." That is not where we want to be in the long term. We don't want to really inspire the wrath of the American people. I am going to bring this to a vote, and I need enough of you Republicans to pass it. And you Tea Partiers, you don't have to vote for it. But if I don't have enough people to vote this is going to be a horrible embarrassment, and the Republicans will be blamed for the government defaulting and the United States, becoming a deadbeat nation. And that's the kind of power that party has, and the value that party has, and why, like you said, a big bunch of different factions with no real allegiance to some bigger tent would cause very difficult problems to overcome when passing laws and getting stuff done. Of course, you might be a fan of that, Mr. Senator. I remember last episode you talked about how wonderful it might be if we had a little less stuff going on and with the national government getting involved, which, by the way, we're going to have an episode on.
Yeah, I agree with you, and indeed, I do. The last point, the last sort of benefit, and then you might be able to chime in on some benefits. It's sort of a simple. This is what we've known from the beginning as a country. We've known 2 parties. Going all the way back to the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, when we had the informal parties, but they existed. And then we started getting a little more formal with the Jacksonian Democrats, and we had the Whigs, and then we went on to the Republicans and the Democrats in the middle of the 19th century. This is what this country has known, and to change that, to fundamentally opening up the party system to multiple parties, I wonder what some of the unintended effects of that is. And perhaps we spoke about it earlier with sort of a messier system, a political system, but a benefit that it's what we've known, so we're used to it. There's comfort, and there's comfort in that.
Right. Well, and you're really talking about 2 things. You're talking about kind of a cultural appreciation and historical appreciation of it, but you're also talking about the unintended consequences. Think about this for a second. the founding fathers divided the government into a bicameral legislature, 2 houses.
Mm-hmm.
They divided it into a presidency. They divided it into a judicial branch. Then they kind of, had all these rules about where a lot of the rules have changed since then about how you get elected and so on and so forth. But basically, had this divided government on these different places, and I'm sorry, they had the powers divided so that no tyrant could be born. That there would be no one dictator. Read, King of England. There'd be no one dictator that would come in and control the legislature and basically be judge, jury, executioner, law passer, decider in chief, whatever. Now, if one of the potential benefits of electing a party in overwhelming numbers is that they can actually have a chance of gaining control of both houses and the presidency, which over time the judiciary. But judiciary is a little bit less relevant here, but in terms of passing bills, that would mean you potentially have one party passing bills in the House and the Senate and being supported by the president. Now, whether you like it or not, the Affordable Care Act would not exist today were it not for the supermajority of Democrats in the Senate. And if you like Obamacare, if you like the Affordable Care Act, that's a remarkable achievement that only worked because there was a sea change election in 2008, and we got massive legislation passed, big things passed. And so you got to wonder if you had a faction system where just you couldn't have any hope. Yeah, it never would happen. You'd never have enough to get 60 to force a vote for cloture, for example. What kind of consequences is that going to create? And there are, I think, good reasons to seriously ask, maybe we shouldn't try to factionalize our parties for that reason alone, because our Constitution is not set up for it.
Well, if you're using the passage of the Affordable Care Act as a reason why we shouldn't factionalize, I would disagree. I would disagree with you.
It's merely a teaching tool, merely by a way to explain why it could be, under some circumstances, if everybody were to like it, a really great thing, right? And maybe 20 years from now, people decide that they like Affordable Care Act. I don't know. I'm not here to judge it. I really don't want to get into the wisdom of the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
This particular
That's
show.
a whole other show. Yeah, that's a whole other show.
Point being,
let's get to the downside.
Stuff like that's possible. Go ahead. Well, I have one benefit I wanted to mention.
Okay, go ahead.
So, it's something that may be a little complicated thought for me to express. So I'm gonna try to do it justice here. You need 2 parties, and the reason you need or at least 2 viable parties, is because there are problems that this country faces, and sometimes So take for example the deficit, right? We have, or at least we had recently, a real big. Not necessarily we had deficit and a debt problem. They're 2 different things. The deficit being how much money we add to the pile of debt, which is the total accumulated amount of money we owe to other people, the pile. We had big problems with it, and it seemed like Democrats weren't really doing their job and making sure that was addressed. Or at least that was the kind of consensus, I think, in what a lot of Americans thought, and a lot of them elected Republicans because of that. And the Republicans said, our goal is to reduce the deficit. That was what they were arguing for a number of years. That was their chief means of getting elected. That was what their stump speeches were all about. Deficit, 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 debt, debt, debt. We are going to cut the deficit. Whether or not that's actually what they were going to do, that's a different question. Whether or not that was what they're really, saying, that's a different issue. But suffice to say, that's why they got elected. And for sure, the Republican Party's strong stance on deficits has really irritated a lot of Democrats, because the Republican Party has kind of said, we're not going to care too much about sequestration. We're not going to care too much about cutting the budget. We're not going to care too much about whether or not that cuts programs precious to the hearts of Democrats. We're not going to care too much about these things. We're going to get it done, and we're going to put immense pressure on in both houses and in the presidency to get this done. And Democrats, meanwhile, are kicking and screaming and saying, no, you can't get rid of this program, you can't get rid of that program, whatever. You can't cut this, you can't cut that. When what I mean by this is, why is this important for there to being a two-party system? Why is this, matter? Because we need the Republicans to be the villains sometimes, if you're a Democrat, to be the villains sometimes to get the hard things done that need to get done. And Democrats can call the Republicans the villains, and the Republicans can be the heroes to their base, and this can happen in the opposite way. And that's not something that can necessarily happen if there are multiple parties. When you've got
a party... very, very good...
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying that was a very good, interesting point that I had never considered. Go ahead.
No, I mean, that's basically my point.
All right, well, we're going to end the benefits on that and get to the downsides, because I think that was a good point to add. Downside. The first one I have is that we have fuzzy parties, or I should say sometimes fuzzy parties, and that we have generic platforms, but we have conflicting interests within these generic platforms. So, for example, we have labor unions on the issue of the Affordable Care Act in recent months. We have labor unions who are set with the law and so it's some of the dictates of the law, and you have minority and poor groups within the Democratic caucus who love this thing, and the labor unions who are not, who wanted to be exempted from it. And that you have these conflicting interests from within in this one issue. But then you also have teachers unions who are in conflict with big city Democratic mayors' plans and pension reform. And you can go on down the list in that you have these really fuzzy parties, and that if you're a teacher and you vote and you're a Democrat, and you want to support a Democrat, you have to think twice, maybe three times about voting for a big city Democrat, because you know that this individual is probably going to have to deal with making you pay more into your pension, cutting your health benefits, making you pay more into that. And so there's this conflict there. Now, go ahead. That's the one point I want to make, that these intra-party conflicts exist, but the parties are really fuzzy in that they don't really talk about the conflicts. They throw out the very generic platform, and if you're a low information voter and all you want to know is whether the person is a D or an R without looking at and thinking about and consuming you very well could be voting against your own self-interest, because the parties are so generic, and you can't make a decision. You have to weigh your options here.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
That's a downside.
Yeah, go to your next downside.
The next downside, and it's sort of the opposite of a collective action problem. So what I mean by that, so this whole idea of a free rider. So instead of there being a free rider who does nothing and receives benefits born of the cost of others, you very well may have a representative group who does everything to get their party elected, and then they're ignored or taken for granted by the party. So they're the opposite of the free rider, because they're a part of this really huge tent, and you have all these competing factions. And we go back to the saliency. You may be a representative body who's doing a lot of work, but your issue is not particularly salient right now. So the party has nothing to benefit from promoting your issues. But you're doing all this work to get your party elected, and you're getting none of
the special interest groups, which, by the way, can include anything from oil and gas to, you can consider a special interest group pro-life, being pro-choice,
Right.
all these different things can be be special interests, but those people work night and day. They are the foot soldiers. If you're pro-life movement, you're the foot soldier of the Republican Party. If you're a labor union, you are the foot soldier of the Democratic Party. You work day and night tirelessly to elect these people in the hopes that they're going to be there for you when you need them. And then you have moments like when Barack Obama didn't stay, like he said, stand in the streets with those labor union leaders when Wisconsin, can't remember his name at the moment.
Scott Walker.
Scott Walker, right? Kind of was going after the union, I guess, benefits or regulations or whatever it was. And Barack Obama had said, I'm going to stand with you in the streets. I'm going to walk beside you. I'm going to put on my shoes and I'm going to walk. And these labor unions are like, yeah. And then, when this comes time, Scott Walker is starting to, oppress the labor unions, obviously from their perspective. Scott Walker is attacking us. Where are you, Mr. President? Nothing. Total silence. Absolutely nothing. It's like, oh, that's kind of a state issue, because the president had just lost pretty horribly. Scott Walker owes his. Scott Walker was elected right after President Obama was elected. Right? He was elected in 2010, isn't that right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. So he's kind of one of those anti-Obama waves. He rode the anti-Obama wave into office, and Obama got rebuked in the midterms, as almost every new president does, by the way.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
And old president, 6-year itch.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, if you go back and look at midterms of second terms of presidents. They don't look very hot for the incumbent president or the incumbent party.
Well, there you go.
So you have midterm itch and the 6-year itch. It's just the way history. It's just the way it went.
Yeah. So you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I think these people, they really work very hard, and to have that key moment of influence when it counts, and then it's just like time and time again they just lack the influence that they want, and they get so mad, but they can't do a dang thing about it, because at the end of the day, the person that they elected to office is much better for them than the person that didn't get elected to the office who they ran against.
It does make you wonder if they were a separate entity or a separate faction that couldn't be taken for granted, whether that would increase their clout, especially among both of the major parties. So, and that, I don't know if that makes a case for creating smaller factions.
Oh yeah, that's true. A smaller faction would need those groups much more, and might not be able to ignore them when it comes time for big votes.
And then there another downside in going back, talking about this issue of being ignored or being taken for granted. So you have these groups that are on the quote unquote fringes, and they're being silenced as a group because they don't belong to a two-party system, and like I said before, the two parties have created laws and place hurdles in the way of any of these groups. And what I mean by fringe, I'm not just speaking small in size. They could be fairly large fringe groups that can't get anywhere because the hurdles are too high for them. But some people say that the sort of fringe groups that don't belong to these two-party systems, it's good that they've been silent. So no one wants to hear from the John Birch Society, and maybe that's a little passe, because I don't think John Birch is really something that a lot of people know what that is today. But
who are John Birch?
You say what?
Who are they?
Let's just say the John Birch Society was the Tea Party before the Tea Party existed. They were the secret elites, fringe elites in the 50s and 60s on the right, who were very much tied in with a lot of conspiracy theories and things of that nature.
Fluoridation of water?
But you said what? Yes,
fluoridation of water?
All that stuff. And but they were a little more clandestine than the Tea Party is now. The party is fairly loud. The John Birches were not loud, but I think people also should recognize that there were a lot of fringe, quote unquote, fringe movements that didn't belong to the two-party system. That had they not existed, we wouldn't have had abolition. We wouldn't have women's suffrage, and gays and lesbians would not have the benefits that they have today, because all of these fringe, quote, fringe groups were not a part of either of the two parties at some point in their existence. And they fought and they won, and eventually they became a part of these party coalitions. But you wonder what else exists out there at the suffrage movement, the next abolitionist movement, the next movement for gays and lesbians, silenced and stifled right now because the two parties are in control and they don't want to have anything to do with them.
I'll give you an example.
Go ahead.
I'll give you an example. How about the fact that our Congress, our Senate, well, I guess I include Senate, House of Reps and Senate, President, Judiciary, are very unrepresentative in terms of religion in this country. We've got I think we have one non-religious person in office, which is pretty incredible considering that something like 15 to 20% of Americans are now considering themselves non-religious. It's the the fastest growing minority, other than like Hindus, which is just because there's so few Hindus. Fastest growing religious minority in this country. In fact, there are far more atheists, even not necessarily just non-religious. There's actually atheists are something like 2 to 5%, something like that. And then there are even Jews. And the amount of power that Jews have in this country is pretty fantastic. And yet you say you're an atheist, and all of a sudden, whoa! You better kiss your political life goodbye, because not the Democrats, not the Republicans are going to be supporting you. They don't want to be within 1,000 million light years of a candidate who's saying that they're a Democrat or they're a Republican and they're an atheist. Despite the weird, which is weird given so many people's fixation with Ayn Rand lately. That doesn't really make any sense to me. They kind of conveniently ignore that was kind of an atheist thing, which doesn't mean that everything that Ayn Rand did is an atheist thing, or everything that all atheists are somehow Ayn Randites, which is not the case at all. Just like not all Christians are, Republican or Democrat or whatever. It's just that you can't say that. But I would say that's a great example. Religious minorities, the next big kind of area for, I think, political debate might be, hey, we've got a new candidate and this candidate is not religious. Is that a thing? Does that matter? And maybe that's a subject for another show.
That is an excellent example, and it is a subject for another show, and I'd love to talk about that, because I think that it very well is an emerging issue that's coming up, and people are going to have to start dealing with it, because, like you said, there's a growing number of non-religious people, public policy and politics, and eventually folks are going to have to confront it. But I say this has been a damn good discussion of the two-party system. And I don't know if you have any closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts. I would say, the question I keep thinking about in my head is, do we keep it? Do we continue with this system? Given its flaws, given that horrible kind of, what do they call that? Whatever system that I mentioned earlier. It's getting late at night.
Bicameral.
Not bicameral, but the binary system. Given that horrible, situation that creates such horrible negative incentives for the party that's out of power, or at least the minority party. Do we keep that? And well, maybe sometimes we need it, right? Maybe sometimes Democrats want to reduce the deficit, but they can't seem to get their base to do it, so they need the Republicans to be the villainous enemy. Maybe that's essential. All I know at this point, Mr. Senator, is that our party system is not working very well, and at the very least, what we need is, I think, some real leadership, people who are willing to stand up and not necessarily, do what's popular for their constituency, but do what's right for the betterment overall of the party. I think John Boehner is trying to, but I'm not sure that he is going to be able to do it. I think Obama probably is trying to, but I'm not sure he's going to be able to do it. I'm not sure. I guess overall maybe we keep the system. What do you think?
I will, and leave it at that.
I'm sorry, you broke up there. What'd you say?
I said I will close with this line and leave it at that. We don't need a third party. We need a bunch of parties.
All right. Well,
we need a lot of them. I'm pro-faction.
Pro-faction, okay.
We need a lot of them. We need a bunch of parties, but
so you come out on the other side.
I come out on the other side, and with that, I think we'll close this discussion. Been very good discussion.
Yes. All right. Well,
the two parties.
Thanks everybody for watching. Tune in next
week,
or whatever you're doing, connecting to us via YouTube or connecting to us via SoundCloud, or I don't know exactly how we're advertising or what we're putting up these days. But thanks for listening. This has been another episode of We Should Talk. I am Solaris.
I am Mr. Senator.
All right. See you all next time.